Welcome to this webinar. It's Susan Anaforth here again. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Invasive Species Council of BC. And thanks to everybody for joining today. The webinar is entitled Responding to Agricultural Weeds in the Cariboo, as you know. Apologies again for last week's technical difficulties. We'd never had this particular issue before. I guess there's a first time for everything. As noted earlier, for those who could not attend today, we are recording this webinar and a PDF will also be available. The webinar is being presented by Dave Ralph, who's the Manager of Operations with the Council. As you know, invasive plants are a big concern for agricultural producers. Dave will be addressing the highest priority of weeds that affect production in the Cariboo region. We'll also hear from Ksenia Kolodka, Outreach Coordinator with the Council, who will review the Report Invasives app as well as the Weeds BMP. I hope everybody had a chance to sign in early and get any technical problems worked out. If you're still experiencing any problems, write a note in the chat box to the right-hand side of your screen and we'll see if we can assist you. Everybody has been muted, so you should only be able to hear myself and Dave. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the chat box in the right-hand column of your screen. Dave and Ksenia will be taking time at the end of the presentation to discuss questions. If we run out of time to address all the questions, we'll send out the questions and answers by email. If you are writing a question, please add a question mark at the end of the question, because this program recognizes and separates questions for us. That would be great. To begin with, we'd like to find out who's here and where you all work, or what your areas of interest are. If you haven't already, can you all please type in your name and workplace or area of interest in the chat box, and we can review these while I'm introducing Dave. Funding for the project has been provided in part by the ISCBC and in part by the governments of Canada and BC under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, a federal, provincial, territorial initiative. Funding is administered by the Investment Agriculture Foundation of BC and the BC Agricultural Research and Development Corp. This project is part of the Regional Adaptation Program delivered by the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative. Thanks to all our funders. At this point, I'm pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Dave Ralph, who is the Manager of Operations with the ISCBC. Dave has extensive knowledge and experience with invasive species, particularly invasive plants, having worked in this area for the BC government for several decades. Dave joined the Council in May 2015. He has worked extensively with land managers and the agricultural industry in developing invasive plant management strategies and in carrying out research for invasive plant control and management recommendations for pasture, range, and intensive crop production. Dave's current role with the Council is with training, operations, and project coordination. We will also hear from Ksenia Kolodka, Outreach Coordinator with the ISCBC in Williams Lake. Ksenia has a Bachelor of Arts in Information and Media Studies and a Master of Environment and Sustainability, both from Western University. She has experience working in the nonprofit environmental sector with communications and with invasive plant management fieldwork. Today's presentation will look at several of the highest priority weed species that affect agricultural production in the Cariboo. Dave will present some strategic management options that can be taken to effectively prevent and manage these species. Ksenia will review 2 free phone apps that enable users to identify, report, and manage invasive weeds. At this point, Dave, I'll pass the mic over to you. I hope everyone enjoys the webinar.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everybody. Again, apologies for last week, but we're happy that we're able to make it up this week. So I'm going to be talking today about the strategic integrated management of some of the priorities invasive plants in the Cariboo region. I'm going to deal at the beginning of the presentation with a strategic approach, and in the latter part of the presentation, I'll get into some more specific prescriptive management options for specific weed species. So integrated pest management, IPM. This is how we always approach any type of pest that we're trying to manage or we're dealing with. And indeed, pest management could easily be replaced with integrated plant management in this slide. So what is involved in IPM? It's a decision-making process. It's a process that prevents invasive plants from becoming a problem, suggest actions to take if the plants do become problems. It doesn't eliminate all invasive plants. That's not the intent. The intent is to bring them under an economic threshold, which I'll get into later. The goal is to reduce the damage caused by invasives and also to reduce the adverse impact to the industry, and also to protect the environment. So components of IPM, I like to use these 6. There's varying versions out there of IPM, but these 6, I think, fit the process that we like to use in BC. And of course, the first thing we do is we want to prevent invasive plants from invading. And this often is a matter of making us dealing with our resources, making it competitive in our crops or our landscape vegetation to prevent them from being introduced. We want to be able to identify the invasive plants or species that we're dealing with. We want to be knowledgeable about them. If we don't know anything about an invasive plant, how are we going to make some decisions on how we're going to address it? Mapping and inventorying of the weed populations and recognizing the damage that they cause. If you don't know where your weeds are located and you haven't done an inventory, you don't know what species we are dealing with, how would you ever be able to start making decisions on how you're going to address them or manage them? Making control decisions based on that knowledge that you have of the weed or invasive plant, the potential damage that it's costing or causing, the cost of the control methods, environmental impact. These are all things that you'll be thinking about when you are making your decisions for what kind of tools or methods you're going to be using to manage the invasive plants. And it's always combinations. Very rarely is one single management method or approach going to give us the results we're looking for. So we're always looking at combining methods. Perhaps we want to use some chemical control on a weed site and then do some in biocontrol agent introduction. This has been done in the States for a few weed species and has proven some good results. This is where we're trying to bring our threshold, injury threshold down. And of course, you have to monitor the effectiveness of your treatments or your methods, and you're going to be definitely making adjustments and where needed down the road to improve. So many of you have seen this slide before. It's the invasion curve. And down at the introduction and detection phase of the lower part of the curve here, that's where we want to catch the weeds or the invasive plants when they're first coming in. This is our best opportunity and time to manage them, to bring them under control, perhaps eradication. Definitely eradication is a possibility when it's in a very low level of infestation. As the infestations increase in size, eradication becomes less likely. And we're looking at maybe just doing a containment. But anyways, it's we as land managers are we wanting to be involved in the invasion curve down at the introduction level. Preventative actions, definitely seeding, establishing a desirable competitive vegetation cover to resist invasion or to suppress weeds that have come in into the area. We definitely want to look at pathways and vectors that the weeds spread, gravel pits, vehicles, people, animals. People are the major cause of spread of invasive plants above any other source. Eliminate the introduction of invasive plants. If we can eliminate that introduction, stop them from spreading to a new area, that's what we're trying to achieve. That's our goal. And wildflowers, although controversial, I'm not a big fan of wildflower mixes. There's often the species are not well identified within wildflower mixes. There's a lot of species in the wildflower mixes that are very similar to the species we are dealing with as problems in BC, i.e. Centuria genus. And as a bit of an anecdote. A number of years ago, there's been invasive plants have showed up in various wildflower mixes that have been planted in various areas. So definitely know what's in the mixes. And as well, if you're buying seed for revegetating, my suggestion would be that you get a certificate of analysis from your seed supplier so you know exactly what's in that. Identification is sort of two-pronged here. You definitely want to know and be able to identify the weed species based on its characteristics and so forth. But also you want to identify what the underlying cause of that invasive plant problem is. You are wanting to deal with the cause of your problem, not let it evolve into where you're just trying to establish a cure or you're dealing with the symptoms. Mapping and inventory. If you have to know their location, where and how the weeds arrived, where the agricultural and natural areas are, any sensitive areas. Without this information, you really don't know where to start. You really want to get an overall view. It doesn't have to be really detailed or technological. Mere satellite photos or maps with hand-drawn areas of infestations and what the species is, how you're going to deal with it, maybe some specific information like pesticide-free zones or high water marks to avoid any chemical contamination of natural areas if that's your choice of management tool. You really want to have a good overview. Then you can start establishing where you're going to start, what your goals are going to be, and what your objectives are going to be. What are the objectives? What are we going to do in order to reach our goal? Are we going to eradicate the leafy spurge infested area, or are we going to reduce it to a more manageable or contained level? These are some of the choices you're going to be making. Treatment options and control choices. These are the standard ones in invasive plant management we are dealing with, and indeed IPM. We want to use all the tools we have at our disposal in order to achieve our desired outcomes. Definitely cultural control using seeding, doing tillage. Maybe you're using targeted grazing goats. There's a goat herd down in the Canoe Creek Band. They have about 150 goats. They're eager to put them to use in the Cariboo. You might want to look at that. Cows Eat Weeds is a program that Tricia Nairn, range agrologist out of the Forest Service in Williams Lake, brought to the Cariboo, and it's a good option for ranchers who are looking at controlling weeds. Lots of options for a chemical. Maybe backpack is the suitable tool. Larger spray units or sprayers like the quad down here is maybe more appropriate for larger infestations. And I like to use the wick wiper. It's very good for individual plant application of a herbicide. No drift, no drip, no soil contamination. It's directed right to the plant. Good for small sites. Biological control. Of course, BC is one of the leaders in North America in biological control of invasive plants. And we continue to work very diligently to try to expand our arsenal of biocontrol agents for some of our more impactful invasive plants. Don't disregard mechanical use. Definitely, there's some areas where we can't use other suitable methods, and we're relegated to using hand-pulling digging. One of the things I like to mention is if you are dealing with a taprooted invasive plant, such as blueweed or burdock, if you are digging that out, if you can get below 2 inches of the below the soil surface and get the top 2 inches of that root or lower, you have a good opportunity to manage that plant and indeed kill that plant so it doesn't reoccur. Considerations for decision when you're looking at it from an IPM approach is what species or complex are you dealing with? Are they annuals, perennials? Are they toxic? These are some of the considerations that you're going to be taking into mind when you're looking at making your decisions for the choices of the tools you're going to use. What life stage is the plant at? Is it just a rosette, or is it a well-established and mature seed plant that's already set seed? What's the site used for? Is the site urban or rural, close to water, close to rare and endangered habitat or species? These are going to definitely play a big part in what choices you make. Costs of treatment, of course, we're always looking at dollars and cents, and that's definitely a consideration. Consequences of not treating, or consequences of not treating at this particular time. Safety concerns. I know the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure has a very big concern with the knotweed species and its ability to create impaired vision or block road signs on the highway. So that's definitely an area that we have to take into consideration for certain species. Is there anything in the area that will be impacted by invasives? And of course, do we need to actually take action against an invasive plant? Is it under biological control? Like some of the species we have in BC, the diffuse knapweed, hound's tongue, just a few to mention. Monitoring. You definitely want to monitor to see what your effects are, what changes you have to make. This is pretty imperative. And then maybe perhaps the cycle of management starts again, and you put a few other different combinations or introduce some new methods. So thresholds, this is some definitions. So your threshold is the level of weed population, the amount of damage that leads to you deciding to make a decision. You recognize that the invasive plant or the pest is having an impact, and you've actually put the thought into making a decision there. Threshold, the injury threshold, that's the point when a weed population reaches numbers that incur unacceptable injury or damage. Indeed, sometimes there's an acceptable level of damage or injury, something that a level that doesn't necessarily have a big impact on the quality of the crop, or doesn't have a big impact on the volume or of the crop, or so forth. So things to consider. And your action treatment threshold, that's the point at which a treatment should be started to prevent the weeds or the invasive plant from reaching that injury threshold. And I guess this is an example. The injury threshold I could probably, as a rancher, put up with or accept a few leafy spurge plants throughout my pasture, but as the photo on the right shows, that would be an unacceptable level of infestation for me. There's virtually no desirable forage or forage value to that, as well as the fact that leafy spurge is a toxic plant, so has effect on your animal's health. So these are the 8 species I'm going to be talking about today. The top 4, Hoary, Alyssum, Marsh, Plume, Orange Hawkweed, and Hoary Cress, fairly well established in the Cariboo region, but at the same time still of concern to a lot of areas where it hasn't entered or found its way. And then the bottom 4, Perennial Pepperweed, Field Scabious, Blueweed, Black Henbane, very high priority species in the Cariboo, not large areas of are infested currently, and we would like to keep it that way. So these are the common herbicides that we're using for our noxious or invasive plant management in BC. They are been very effective on the species that we have dealing with in BC. We've worked extensively over the years with the chemical companies to test and do trials on these species, on these chemicals on all of the weed species we have in BC. And so in the following slides, I'll be outlining which one of these herbicides we find is the most effective for control. So Hoary Alyssum is initially about 30 years ago was found in McClure, which is just north of Kamloops and down east of the Grand Forks in the Boundary Country. Now Hoary Alyssum is very well established throughout the southern interior. One of the things that I'd like to point out to you is that the seed pods in the photo, top photo on the right, they develop as Hoary Alyssum matures. So the bottom seed pods, they mature early in the season, and as the season progresses, the plant puts on growth in the terminal shoot and stem. Viable seeds are being produced all year long in the Hoary Alyssum species. So this is one of the characteristics. Unlike a lot of plants, they set seed, viable seed, at the end of their growth period when they mature. Not so for Hoary Alyssum. So Hoary Alyssum is easily controlled by pulling and cutting. Pulling, it's a tap-rooted plant, and it comes out of the ground very well. Mowing or cutting well below the flower, indeed right down at the root crown, is also effective at eliminating seed production. It is only spread by seed. Cultivation in the crops situation or in a heavily infested field also works well. Deep plowing, turning that soil over and burying the Hoary Alyssum plants and seeds about 6 inches below the surface is a good approach to not having Hoary Alyssum recur. And then, of course, getting that seed down right quickly, whatever your crop may be, to offer that competition. Being a member of the mustard family, these are the herbicides that work well. We don't find picloram or aminopyralid alone work well on Hoary Alyssum. We do find that glyphosate is effective. I'm not a big fan of glyphosate in a lot of situations because glyphosate is non-selective, kills all plants it comes in contact with, and therefore you have a bare patch, and the first thing that moves into bare patch is always going to be weeds. 2,4-D suppresses it. Aminopyralid plus metsulfuron methyl alone as Clearview or with 2,4-D as Reclaim, we find is probably the best, most effective herbicide on Hoary Alyssum. This is currently the infested areas of BC where Hoary Alyssum is found. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's that dense, but whenever a site is found and reported, it is located on the IAP database, and these distribution maps you'll find are courtesy of FLNRORD and the IAP administrator, and that section of the FLNRO. Marsh plume thistle, predominantly found up in the Robson Valley and through to Prince George and then down south to Quesnel. There are some locations elsewhere in the province that I'll show you at the end here. It is a tap-rooted plant as well, spreads by seed. Some of the characteristics of this plant are seen here on these photos in that it has a very dense cluster of flower heads at the very top of the plants, the stems. Unlike most other Cirsium species of thistle, the stem is very ribbed with spiny wings. It's a very difficult plant to pull because of these armed mechanisms that it has, and it's also a very good competitor with desirable and native vegetation. Up in the Robson Valley, I've seen marsh plume thistle grow in very thick, densely dense sedge meadows. It likes to grow in dry areas as well as very moist areas. It's a difficult plant to control. If you pull up marsh plume thistle out, we've seen, and you lay the rosette down on the ground, it can often reroot itself in some of these wet areas. Cutting and mowing, if you're eliminating that top of the plant, it is a seed producer, so you've eliminated seed production. It also, you want to encourage competitive and desirable vegetations, not necessarily that big of a deal in these wet meadows where marsh plume thistle likes to grow, but definitely on some drier sites, you can definitely have reduce the density of marsh plume with good competitive vegetation. It grows very tall. Indeed, the photo on the top of the slide, there is somebody standing in that infestation and they have their hand raised in the air. So it can grow well beyond 6 feet. A lot of the herbicides we have in our arsenal that we use for invasive plants are very effective on marsh plume thistle. And indeed, we could add metsulfuron methyl and aminopyrrolid as Clearview to that a list of effective herbicides as well. Currently, biocontrol is pending. The research folks with the biocontrol out of FLNRO-RD and the biocontrol program have been busy over the last number of years seeing if any other Cercium species biocontrol agents have an effect on marsh plume thistle. So this is the Robson Valley, the dense cluster up there. We have marsh plume thistle is known out in the Rupert area. That was one of the historic sites in BC, and it's also found its way down into the west area of Revelstoke around Craigellachie. So and isolated infestations around the province. Those are very high priority areas outside that dense infestation. There is a containment area from McBride to Prince George and then south to the highway out to Barkerville. Orange hawkweed. If you're living or working or traveling or ranching in the Cariboo, you definitely know about orange hawkweed. It's a very aggressive plant. It is a perennial as well as a biennial. We've seen them live more than 2 years. First year, rosette, doesn't set a stem up and produce flowers or seeds. It's a difficult plant to control once it gets established through cultural methods, but very effective control when it is just starting out as a plant or an infested area. Pulling's difficult. The stolons that are associated with orange hawkweed, much like strawberries, stolons, they're very hard to get all of the pieces out of the infested area. Cutting or mowing definitely reduces seed production and will give you a little bit longer control as it reduces the volume of seeds that are produced. Burning, not very typically effective. Indeed, most of the weed species we deal with, burning on the ground or in the field is very not a good idea. Usually the heat caused from a burn in the field is not hot enough to get to destroy the seeds that are in the plants, and indeed often causes more damage to the desirable plants. One of the things we found with some of the research we did over the years on orange hawkweed, we did soil sampling at 30 different sites throughout BC where we found orange hawkweed back in the 80s, early 90s. We found all of those sites with the exception of one was low or deficient in sulfur, typically on old forested sites, which isn't uncommon. We did some fertilization trials using nitrogen and sulfur. Our application rate of nitrogen was about 50 kilograms active or 50 kilograms per hectare active or nitrogen, or 50 pounds per acre active nitrogen, and then the sulfur component that was in that fertilizer mix. Typically around 35-00-11, 11% sulfur, or 45-00-16, I think is pretty close to what is available out of the bag. We found that if a field or a pasture was less than 15%, less than 20 to 15% orange hawkweed, the application of this nitrogen fertilizer, sulfur fertilizer, reduced the infestation of orange hawkweed to a very acceptable level. The nitrogen enhanced the grass growth, and the sulfur did definitely have an impact on the um, growth and ability for the orange hawkweed to grow well. Lots of different herbicides that are available in our arsenal for orange hawkweed. What we do find is if your infestation is above 20%, perhaps a herbicide application to get rid of the orange hawkweed initially, and then followed by a fertilizer schedule, you likely won't have to go back and do any more herbicide treatment. Gall-forming wasp and root-feeding fly have been released in BC, but they are not in the operational level yet, and they're still being monitored. Orange hawkweed very well established throughout BC. Not as densely found, not as dense and commonly found as the southeastern portion of the province. Map of the province here might indicate, but still a concern when it gets into areas of agricultural production or sensitive or natural areas. Hoary cress. There's 3 different species of hoary cress in BC: globe, lens-potted, and heart-potted. They all look very similar. The difference in the plants typically is found in the seed structures or the flower structures of the plant. Perennial has lateral roots or rhizomatous roots or rhizomes, and very difficult to control with manual methods. Once established in agricultural production, it's pretty hard to get rid of, and it's unpalatable, so it's not a very appealing plant to look at or a very desirable plant to have in your operation at all. Cutting and mowing, it reduces seed production, but as a rhizome plant, that plant will continue to exist, and you're just really suppressing it and reducing seed production and reducing the energy in the roots by carrying out any manual control. Tillage, pretty lot, as it mentions here, if you're dealing with hoary cress as a tillage, with a tillage perspective, you're going to have to be out there doing tillage pretty regularly in order to have reduce it. And again, it's a mustard species, so it has a rather limited number of herbicides that are effective. The dicamba 2,4-D would be suppressed, would suppress the plant, and you'd be looking at aminopyralid plus 2,4-D, and also Clearview, aminopyralid plus metsulfuron methyl at 2,4-D, and 2,4-D in order to get a really good control of it using herbicide. There's hoary cress in its distribution throughout BC, so not very well distributed throughout BC. Very little of it up in the Cariboo. Keep an eye out for it. We definitely want to keep it that way. I'll bring up perennial pepperweed next because it looks very similar to hoary cress. Again, same family. It's a mustard. Has a rhizome for a root system and very aggressive. Has a big impact down in the States. It likes to grow along irrigation canals, and indeed that's where it really flourishes well as a plant, when it has an abundance of moisture to draw from. However, it also will flourish and grow very well in very dry areas. One of the historical sites for perennial pepperweed in BC is along Highway 1 at Wallachine, just between Cache Creek and Kamloops. Wallachine and that region around there is one of the driest areas of Canada, and indeed is considered a desert habitat in some of the locations in that area. So mechanical control, mowing or spring burning down in the States. I don't know how effective that will be up here. We definitely want to use burning very with consideration as we deal with a lot of fire situations here in BC. If you are going to burn, typically what you're doing is you're pulling a plant, you're piling it, and you're putting it in a burn pile in order to get the heat hot enough to destroy the seeds. Cutting and pulling can manage the weeds and reduce seed set, as I mentioned. Metsulfuron methyl, Clearview is works well, or rather Escort. Dicamba is also suppresses it. Chlorsulfuron is Telar. We've been using imazapyr, Arsenal, on perennial pepperweed. We find it translocates very well into that extensive rhizome. It also has a residuality that carries for about 1 to 2 years, depending on soil and location and the rainfall and so forth. As mentioned here in the slide, glyphosate and 2,4-D have also been effective. Currently, no biocontrol for perennial pepperweed. There's only a few locations in BC, one site down in the East Kootenays near Cranbrook, one up near Windermere Lake. As I mentioned, there's one here at Wallachine that's been dramatically reduced. We've been treating that site since 1996. Every couple of years, we see a couple of plants come back. One at 86 Mile as well in the Cariboo Regional District. Field Scabious. It's a member of the Thistle family. It's has a big impact on agricultural production, pastures. It becomes well established. A perennial taprooted forb. Not a real lot of leaves on field scabious. So as a result, herbicide treatment is typically with a product that has some residuality in the soil to be taken up by the roots. And as well, we often recommend with plants that have a real lack of leaves, using a surfactant also enhances the effect of the herbicide and increases the intake of it. Mowing or cutting is prior to seed set reduces seed production or eliminates it. Cultivation can also work well with this weed. The picture on the top of the slide there, you can see on the right is a control, no herbicide applied. On the left was Escort, metsulfuron methyl, and we found really good control with that. The picture below with the gentleman is a field or a pasture, and it's complete monoculture of field scabious. So you can see how well it moves into an area and how well it establishes itself. I'm going to speed up here a little bit because we're getting close to 22 and I want to leave some time for Ksenia and questions. List of herbicides that are effective on it, as well, no biocontrol currently. These are some of the locations that are in BC that where we find field scabious. Probably the larger infestation is up around the Vanderhoof area, and then spotted infestations as well out in Cottonwood in the east of Quesnel and through some of the northern mid-Cariboo region there. So keep an eye out for it. It's very distinct teasel type of purple flower. Blueweed, taprooted perennial, very difficult to control. We've worked I've done a lot of research for a number of years on blueweed, and I'm yet to come up with a herbicide product that gives me much more than about 1.5 years worth of residual control. It is a taprooted plant, so if you're out cutting it or digging it, you would want to get as much of that root as possible in order to run the opportunity to eliminate that or kill that plant. Repeated defoliation reduces flowering as well as seed production. Small infestations can be managed by hand. I would use gloves if I'm doing blueweed management. There's all kinds of very tiny hairs on the stem, and they sort of have the same type of effect as cedar splinters or slivers do. They're very tiny. One of the things that I would like to just point out to you for a identifying feature here, I'll go back to the first slide. The rosette on the bottom left-hand corner is a first-year plant. It doesn't bolt in the first year and produce seed, but those rosette leaves have tiny little bumps or pimples on them, a very distinct feature of blueweed rosettes. no biological control currently for blue weed. And it's a lot of heavy infestations down in the Cranbrook area where they have a containment area, Lower Nicola, south, east, or west of Merritt, and also isolated infestations in the Cariboo. Black henbane is the last one here I'll deal with. It's currently the newest invader, I think, for the Cariboo. It's a perennial. It's got a very deep taproot, large seed production, has a really odorous smell to it, and is also poisonous. Currently found out in the Alexis Creek area and a few locations, other locations in BC, definitely a high priority. Leaves are alternate. You can see on the photo on the right-hand side there, the veins are very conspicuous in this plant, and the leaves are deeply lobed or shallowly lobed, and they've got a bit of a waviness to them. Really distinct flower from black henbane. They're pale yellow with that dark purple veins in them, and it has got a very high seed production as well. This is a plant that if you could pull out and dig and pile it up and burn it, it would definitely be have an opportunity to kill all those seeds or destroy those seeds. Very high seed production with black henbane. Use gloves when you're pulling it because of its poisonous properties. Unfortunately, targeted grazing wouldn't be an option for management on black henbane because of its poisonous principles. Currently in BC, they don't have any, or there is no biocontrol for black henbane. The major infestation in BC is out at Alexis Creek. A small infestation is found in just outside of Williams Lake, I think at a landfill or a transfer station. There was also a site found just west of Kamloops in a garden in Deadman Creek. One black henbane plant was found by the Southern Interior Weed Management Committee staff, and it's been eliminated. And also there's another known infestation down near Nighthawk, just west of Soyuz. So that's my portion of the presentation here today, and I'm going to pass it over to Ksenia to talk to you about some of the mobile apps for managing and reporting invasives.
Great, Dave. Thanks so much for that great presentation. We're so lucky to have your extensive knowledge and expertise to draw on in this area. So I'd like to introduce Ksenia now from Williams Lake, and she, as Dave said, she's going to chat to you about some of the resources to report and also to manage some of these invasive weeds. So Ksenia, I'll pass the mic over to you.
So I will be speaking about 2 free mobile apps that can help you manage and report invasive species. So the first one is called Weeds BMP. This is an app that was created specifically for livestock and forage producers, and it determines best management practices for various invasive plants. The app contains about 95 invasive plant species within the categories of grasses, sedges, rushes, and broadleaf plants, with more plant species being added soon. The Weeds BMP app also has in-depth information about each plant species, including information about the plant's habitat and ecology, like its ideal growing conditions, the ecological or economic impacts it may pose, some photos to help in identification, and most importantly, some management strategies to control the plant. These may include preventative measures, biocontrol, chemical control, and mechanical control, depending on what the plant is. Weeds BMP gives you information and guidance to help you control and stop the spread of invasive plants on your property, and can therefore help minimize the negative impacts on forage and crop production. This app also has contact information of local and regional invasive plant representatives if you have any further inquiries about best management practices. The second app here is Report Invasives. This app promotes early detection and rapid response of invasive species in British Columbia, which is imperative in stopping the spread of invasive species, especially if they have a high risk of entering a new region. In this app, you can report any type of invasive species if you see it, whether it's a fish or a mammal or an aquatic plant. Each species in the app will have photos to help you identify if it is the exact species that you're observing. Once you find the invasive species in the app, you can then submit a report with your contact information and any photos of the invasive species and surrounding area. This report will go to a BC specialist who will then coordinate follow-up treatment to manage the invasive species. And both of these apps are available for free on the Apple Store or on Google Play. So thank you for listening, and back to you, Dave and Sue.
Those apps, and thanks again, Dave, for that great presentation. We have a bit of time left for questions. So folks, if you haven't already and you have a question, please type it into the chat box and remember to put a question mark at the end. And I'll start with the first question and go through the list of questions till we reach 1 o'clock. As I mentioned, if there's not enough time to address all of the questions, we'll send out the answers to you by email.
Sue, if I could just mention that for those folks in the Cariboo, March 12th, the Cariboo Central Coast Invasive Plant Committee is having a strategic planning session at the CRD, Cariboo Regional District Boardroom, from 10 till 2. Land managers would be advised to attend and have your input.
That's a great tip. Thanks for that, Dave. That's March 12th, and you can probably find that on their website. Is that right?
Yes. Contact Emily Sontag for an RSVP.
Great. At the Cariboo Regional District
Boardroom. Correct.
Thank you. That's great. All right. I see a question come up from Nancy, and she said, what are the names of those two apps again? Nancy, the Report Invasives app is just that, Report Invasives. You can find that fairly easily on the Report a Weed BC site. Excuse me. I really like that app because it's a great field guide as well. Like, I use it in the field quite a bit just to identify invasive species. So that was the first one, Report Invasives, and the second one is the Weeds BMP app. And thanks, Ksenia, for typing that into the chat box. Dave, I have a question for you about the black henbane. I've never seen it. Does it really smell like hens? I was laughing at that slide.
I'm not sure. I really wouldn't be able to say what it smells like, but it is sort of I think it means it's more of a foul smelling rather than a poultry smelling.
I saw that you had written FOWL, and I was thinking, oh, that's why it's called black henbane, but thanks for that. All right. A question coming up from Lori. As a rancher, what all can we do to do our due diligence? We kept cows out of a known hawkweed area last year. I'll direct that one to Dave.
Can I get you to repeat that question again, please, Sue? Sorry.
Sure. So she's asking about doing due diligence around invasive species. So she kept her cows out of a known knotweed area last year, which sounds like a great action to take. Is there other ones as ranchers that you would suggest?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to cattle, definitely wildlife, or they spread weeds. If you've got your animals in an area that is infested with weeds and you're going to move it into another area, if it's possible, what we've often recommended is put them in a pen or a corral or something for a day or two, let them get rid of all of the seeds off of their coats, as well as there's consuming it through their grazing. Seeds typically move right through cattle and are not affected or destroyed at all. Other ways are just, make sure your equipment and your vehicles and your clothing and your animals don't have weed seeds on them. If you are in an area, clean your vehicles. As I mentioned earlier, people and their mechanisms that we move around are the major source of invasive plant spread.
Great. Thanks for that, Dave. Leonie, I see that that someone has typed that into the chat box. The slides will be made available after the presentation, which is great. And you'll also get a PDF link as well. So Eleanor is asking, is there research happening with soil conditioning or soil amendments as a treatment option for some invasive plants?
Yes, there is. I'm not really familiar with the stuff that's going on lately. There was a soils workshop up in Williams Lake the other week that I wasn't able to attend. But at the areas that I attend, you definitely want to be looking at keeping your soils in good fertility. That encourages desirable vegetation to excel and reduces the possibility of invasion or suppresses the weed growth that's already there. And yeah, I would just sort of stay tuned. There's a lot more interest in what impacts soil microbes and the amount of microbes and so forth that are in soils and what impacts they have on invasive plants.
Vanessa Robinson, and she's saying a recommendation, the IAS app uses the location you're currently at when you upload a photo from a smartphone. If you are out of service when you take the photograph and upload it at home, it's difficult to correct the location of the app. He was hoping that someday developers can use that metadata associated with the photographs to ensure these locations are uploaded correctly. This technology is used with both eFlora and iNaturalist, for example. That's interesting. Thanks for that, Vanessa. I see some other folks are typing some questions in. As I say, we're happy to answer questions for the last 4 or 5 minutes here. And Samantha's also adding some information here, which is great. In response to the last question about soils and link to treatments for invasive plants, the presentations at the Ag Weeds ISCBC workshop by Norm Dueck last March spoke quite a bit about the link between soil health and weeds. Maybe this presentation is posted somewhere and could be useful for the person that wrote that question. Thank you so much for that. That's great. We can track that down and, as I say, hopefully send the link out to folks that are interested.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. That's a really good point. I was at that workshop last March. Also saw Norm present down at a BC Forage Council field day in Lumbee this past summer. I would just go onto Google, type in Norm Dueck. He has his own soils consulting company, and he's out of Vanderhoof. Very knowledgeable fellow about soils.
Great. Thanks for that, Dave. So Sabina's got a question about the root feeding hoverfly. She's wondering if it has been released in BC for orange hawkweed, and if so, was it found to be successful? Do you know anything about that, Dave?
No, I would hesitate not to comment on that. I would contact Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development and talk to their biocontrol folks there. They would definitely have that information for you.
Great. Thanks for that.
Hello, Sabina.
All right. I see a few more folks typing. We still have a couple more minutes for questions if people have questions for Dave or Ksenia. That's a very dense presentation, Dave. It's tons of information there, so I'm going to be finding it useful as well, the PDF.
Yes, sometimes I tend to put a little bit more info.
So Deirdre's got a question for you. She's asking, is the blueweed research widely available?
That research was done when I was with the Ministry of Agriculture and also when I was with the Ministry of Forests and Lands. And that research and the information resides with them now, and it's in their files. So I don't have access to it myself. But right. If Deidre wanted to get a hold of me, I could definitely talk to her about some of the research that we have done.
Great. And you can reach Dave. His email is actually on our website too, so you can track him down that way. And Nicole, thanks for putting Susan Turner's name up there for the biocontrol contact. That's great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. I wanted to thank you again, Dave, for that excellent presentation, as well, Ksenia, for joining in. It's really nice to have this expertise today and for sharing it today on behalf of the ISC and behalf of everyone to listen that is listening. We'll be sending out a short link to an evaluation survey to all of you, and we would love it if you filled it out so we can get your feedback and also some ideas for future webinars. We've got several more webinars coming up. Please check the ISC website for more information on upcoming webinars and to register. Thanks everybody for attending, and hope to see you next time.